This is Ahval Online, meeting point of accurate news and free comment on the current affairs of Turkey. Welcome to our podcast series.
Hello and welcome to Talking Turkey. I'm your host, Ahval editor David Lepeska, and with me today is Sasha Ghosh-Siminoff, executive director of the Syria-focused non-governmental organization People Demand Change. Thanks for joining us, Sasha. Hello.
Hi, how are you doing?
Doing well, thanks. We are talking on Wednesday, March 11. Turkey and Russia last week reached a ceasefire deal for Syria's Idlib province, where some 3 million displaced people are squeezed between the Turkish border and the forces of Syrian President Bashar Assad. You've been working on aid in Syria for some time. What have you heard in recent days about the situation on the ground for these displaced people in Idlib?
Well, obviously the situation is very bad. Leading up to this current crisis, we've had 9 years of conflict that have seen Syria's infrastructure writ large damaged and destroyed to a degree that it makes every subsequent crisis that much harder to cope with. And the carpet bombing, and I'm using air quotes, but that's as close to what I think of it as, the carpet bombing by the Russian Air Force in the last few months has really made whole villages and towns and areas uninhabitable. So even if we have a deal that's somewhat permanent as anything can be in Syria, and we wanted people to return, there's really nothing for people to return to. There's no electricity, there's no healthcare, there's no education, the roads are bad, there's most of the residential areas of like Sarakib and Numan, for example, these two larger towns that held many IDPs are now just completely flattened. So there's really nothing to go back to. So we're looking at a prolonged crisis at the Turkish border, and I just don't see anyone returning back to where they were, either living originally or originally displaced to, since many people who live in Idlib or the greater Idlib pocket are not necessarily from Idlib. They're from Aleppo, they're from Hama, they're from Latakia, they're from Homs, they're from far away as Damascus and Dera. So you have whole sets of populations been displaced 3, 4, 5, 6 times, maybe even more. And I think for now they're going to sit at the border and wait until someone comes into and explains to them what is the political and military solution that's going to give them any sort of comfort level that they can go back realistically to their homes without being displaced 6 months or 1 year from now.
Yeah, this week there have been reports of Syrian forces violating the ceasefire and Turkey continuing to reinforce its position in Idlib. Most analysts do not expect a ceasefire to hold, and on Tuesday, U.S. Ambassador to Turkey David Satterfield said that Assad wants to permanently cleanse the country of these displaced people in Idlib, who you say come from all over the country and have been displaced previously. But while Russians, he said, Russia wants to push these people into Turkey because it would force Ankara to make decisions that favor Moscow. Is this how you see it? And if so, will these people be forced into Turkey, and how might that look?
Right. So I do believe that all the evidence of what the Assad regime has done over the last 9 years points to a systematic attempt to ethnically, religiously, ideologically cleanse the country of anyone who opposes his rule. And, before the start of the war, we could say, 70% of the country was Sunni Arab, plus or minus, and he's managed to displace a significant portion of the population, not just also externally, but internally. So they say on average, you could say there's probably 6 million refugees that are now outside of the country. They've displaced around 7 million people, IDPs, inside the country. So he's managed to displace half or more of the entire pre-war population of Syria, and is creating demographic engineering designed to prop up his regime in the long term. And this is not something that's new to the Assad regime. His father Hafez did the same thing, whether it was moving Arab communities in Raqqa and Aleppo around and interspersing them in Kurdish-dominated portions of Hasaka province. What he did to disperse and move around portions of the Alawite community as part of repositioning of his security and military services over the years. So this is nothing new to this regime, but we've never seen it quite on this scale. And, everything with Moscow has been about delaying or pushing the envelope just a little bit in their favor, right? So like, okay, we'll just take this area and then we'll make an agreement and regroup. Okay, we've taken this area, let's push a little more and make another agreement. And so they've worked on to sort of incrementally change the landscape of Syria to favor their and the regime's positions over the last, 5 years since Russia entered the war in 2015. And I think they would be happy to push all these people into Turkey because Russia and the regime can't pay for the essential service provision and aid required to keep an additional 3.5 million people alive. So they definitely don't want these people. And as we pointed out, a lot of these people are people who refused regime control to the extent that even when their areas, their enclaves surrendered, they left and were basically forcibly displaced from their areas to Idlib as this sort of last quote-unquote opposition bastion. So I think on one side you have people on the ground who are like, we cannot go back to the regime. Like we've gotten to the point after all of our displacement and our relationship with the regime that we don't have the option to go back. So they would for sure also prefer to either go to Turkey or go to another neighboring country because they don't feel that they can survive under regime control. And I think Moscow has created a lot of economic and political ties with Ankara that they're now kind of wielding like a broadsword against Turkey and really pressuring Turkey. And obviously Turkey has internal domestic political considerations that come into play when talking about taking millions upon millions more of Syrians into the country. They already have 3.5 or maybe close to 4 million refugees. So that would create a huge strain on the economies of southern Turkey. It would create a huge strain writ large within the country at a time when they can at least afford further economic damage.
Right. If Turkey were to open its Syrian border and allow these displaced people in, one additional concern some analysts have expressed is that jihadist rebels like those from al-Qaeda-linked Hayat Tahrir al-Sham or HTS would mix in with the refugees and slip into Turkey. Do you see that as a legitimate fear?
I would say that it's a legitimate fear in the sense of that, when you have so many people moving en masse, it's hard to create an orderly process by which to verify and understand who people are. So it would be hard to know who would be coming across the border. The sort of the floodgates would open and everyone would enter, more than likely. So that uncontrolled process poses a danger. However, Turkey has been involved in this conflict from day one. They're very aware of the players involved. They have communication and coordination with these players because they've been resupplying their observation posts in Idlib and in HTS controlled territory even. So I think they know who people are, who the leaderships of these various transnational extremist groups are. And I think that they're very aware of their capabilities. But yes, I do believe that they are cognizant that they only have leverage and control over them so long as they're sort of, in Idlib, but the minute they're allowed in Turkey, it's anyone's guess where they might go. However, I would say that given HTS's ideological bent, they're a very locally, inwardly focused Salafi jihadi group. So they haven't espoused a lot of views regarding attacking external targets or fighting the West writ large. It doesn't mean that they're pro-US. The opposite. I'm sure they're very against the US, Turkey, the West. But it's not their main goal, and it's not their main agenda. Their main agenda is focusing on liberating Syria and bringing "quote unquote" Salafi jihadi way of life to people in the Middle East first, and saving the Ummah. So I'm not sure what would be the value of HTS physically entering Turkey aside from saving their people and allowing their ideological movement the opportunity to survive, to do more things later down the road, if that makes sense.
The Turkish President Erdogan met on Monday with European Union officials who basically urged him to abide by the 2016 refugee deal and stop the flow of migrants from Turkey. The next day, yesterday, Erdogan told reporters that he would host a summit in Istanbul next week with the leaders of France, Germany, and maybe Britain to discuss these issues. But it seems to me like right now, nobody seems willing to budge. Europe and Turkey are firm on their no more refugees position, while, as we just said, Syria and Russia are determined to push these displaced people out of Idlib, out of Syria. It almost seems as if the most logical outcome is that these people are going to have to stay indefinitely for an extended period in these ad hoc camps along the border.
Right. So I think on the one hand, Turkey has a lot of baggage, obviously, with Europe and the United States and its other NATO allies. Without a doubt, they've done things that have made that relationship difficult. However, the Europeans really are a bunch of hypocrites. I mean, they've been basically paying Turkey to contain a refugee crisis that they have done very little to help solve. So it's really crazy that, Turkey, who Europe constantly fights with and, discusses with them that their human rights record is bad, that their democratic systems and institutions are eroding. However, Europe is not upholding their own quote unquote moral framework and values of, international law and respect for democracy and human rights by finding a solution to either allowing the refugees to equitably enter and be placed with all the host countries of the European Union, or thinking about an actual solution to the core of this problem, which is the Syrian regime itself. So Europe doesn't want to be blackmailed by Turkey regarding the refugee crisis. Totally fair, totally understandable. But they're also not listening to the fact that Turkey does have serious concerns and has already taken in an enormous number of refugees. It's not like they haven't. They've done their part in terms of who they've taken in. And, again, Turkey has a lot of baggage when it comes to their involvement in this conflict, but they did enter their military this past month. They did successfully halt the regime's ground offensive, and they bought the refugees, or the IDPs, in Idlib some time to flee and get out of the way of the most immediate violence. So I think both sides need to recognize credit where credit's due, and they need to put aside their differences and think realistically how they're going to have a unified front in terms of dealing with the regime and, more importantly, dealing with Russia.
I hope you don't mind if I ask a few questions now just about your story and your connection to Syria.
Sure.
You were living in Syria and studying Arabic, I believe, when the civil war broke out in 2011. Could you just tell me where were you and how did that all look from the inside?
Sure. I was studying Arabic at the University of Aleppo, and I was there basically from January to the middle of April of 2011. And I spent my weekends basically going to Idlib because I had many friends from the university who were from Idlib. Idlib is, a neighboring province to Aleppo, so they share community, they share transportation and economic links. So I would go back and forth to small towns and villages in Idlib all the time. And in the very beginning, when the revolution happened, especially what happened in the middle of March of 2011 in Daraa, the first thing the regime did, which was so interesting, was and we would only hear about it later, my colleagues and I, some of the other Americans that were with me, when we were outside of the country. So that week when things were hitting off in Daraa and you had protests and everything, I mean, we had very little news internally of what was happening. And the regime gave everyone free mobile credit. And when they did this, the cell phone network kind of collapsed in on of itself as everyone was trying to use their free minutes and their free text messages to talk. And that allowed them to basically control the narrative and prevent the spread of the news of what happened in Daraa and the number of people who were killed in the protests. But eventually news seeped out.
Do you think that was the goal of the releasing the free minutes?
Oh, absolutely.
Uh-huh.
The regime has always been so clever in finding different ways of explaining or doing blackout of communications in a way that it seems innocuous, but in fact there's an ulterior motive behind it. A week after what was going on in Daraa, I was in Latakia. I was on spring break basically, and I was in Latakia and Tartus, and as my bus is pulling up to Latakia, there's like massive amounts of black smoke billowing out of the center of the town, and I was asking people on the bus, oh, what's going on? And they're like, oh, I'm not sure, but we know that the city center of Latakia is closed today for a holiday. And later I found out, of course, there's a massive protest inside Latakia city. The security forces have essentially lost control of the city center, and people were burning tires at checkpoints to prevent, the security forces and the army from re-entering and retaking. And this was like March 20th or 25th of 2011, and this is in Latakia, like the quote-unquote hinterland of the Assad regime. So it was a very interesting time. But one of the things that I will note is that in the beginning, I would say there was across the board broad agreement within Syria's society that the Assad regime was corrupt, that the Assad regime needed to be reformed or even replaced. I don't think in the beginning anyone wanted to replace Syria's institutions wholesale. I think there was a hope to reform the system from inside, get rid of the Assad family, and like replace them with people that could allow for some sort of transition, somewhat along the lines of what was going on in Tunisia at the time during the Arab Spring. But I think people underestimated the Assad family's willingness to cling to power at all costs. And they had help from Iran and from Russia and from other regional and global powers that had a lot of interest in maintaining the status quo in Syria. And unfortunately, it's cost the lives of probably 1 million people. It's seen the destruction of 60 or 70% of the country and the displacement of half of its population, all to keep this man and his family in power. It's absolutely devastating.
I read some of the material on the website, and it sounds like People Demand Change uses a sizable network on the ground in Syria, mainly northeast Syria, to provide data and information that improves the delivery of international aid and services. Is that right? Please tell me a bit about the organization and its work.
Sure. I missed being in the field. I missed helping people more directly, and a couple colleagues and friends who were Syrians had made it to the United States and or were already stuck here in the United States and couldn't go home. And we decided that the United States looked like they were going to spend some money in Syria, and they hadn't engaged in Syria on a diplomatic or programmatic level in years. And frankly, given what the United States did in terms of spending aid and development dollars overseas in Afghanistan and Iraq, there was concerns about how funding and programming would go in Syria, in a country where they were doing remote monitoring. They weren't physically there on the ground. They were working from nearby countries, as opposed to Iraq and Afghanistan, where at least they were there in country. So we formed this aid and development organization, and one of my colleagues had a lot of experience in monitoring and evaluation, which is sort of the accountability and a transparency mechanism used in aid and development work in any country that has aid and development, but especially in conflict zones where you're doing basically remote monitoring and management of programming. You need a robust monitoring and evaluation system to confirm that the programming and the aid and the things that you're doing on the ground are being delivered to the right people under the right circumstances, and that there's basically no funny business. So that's how we got involved. We continued through our networks with the peaceful side of the activist movement to support civil society actors, human rights actors, local journalists. We did some capacity building programs, which we still do today. We operate in both northwest and northeast Syria. We try to help all communities equally in terms of access and support. And so far, we've been able to accomplish that mission, but it's not easy. And whenever I think Syria as a conflict can't get any worse, it manages to surprise me. So I won't say it won't get worse, because so far it's only gotten worse as the years have gone on, unfortunately.
I got to say, if I'm Bashar Assad, that name, People Demand Change, certainly does not have a friendly ring to it with its echoes of protest chants. Is that why you chose it?
Indeed, it was. It was definitely inspired by the Arab Spring and the protest movement of the time, in part just because, at the time, for the first time, it seemed like there was this opening that people in the Middle East finally had enough. And they said, look, we want a voice in the political system. We want to participate actively in our political system. We're tired of these authoritarian regimes that not only don't give us a voice, but then steal from us and are so corrupt and make it so hard just to survive day to day. As an example, like the amount of bribes people paid in Syria just to get by in daily life. You felt like any time you're giving a bribe, a slice of it somehow went to the Assad family, one way or another. From the tiniest police ticket to a larger bribe, to get, that piece of paperwork that would allow you to open a business. That kind of sort of corruption on all levels of society, it wasn't sustainable. And I think people, especially the younger generation at the time, just had enough and didn't feel like there was anything to lose by rising up and asking for change. And I was personally very affected by that. And I felt like for once, maybe the West would, do the right thing, support these protest movements, allow the region to transition to a state of being that would be more stable and, frankly, support the aspirations of the people, which, in my opinion, would more readily support the values and the principles that supposedly Western countries hold, respect for human rights, respect for open, pluralistic societies that participate in an accountable and transparent governance process. I hate to use the word democracy because democracy is such a vague term, and democracy as a concept, I don't think always, everyone does democracy differently in their country, right? There's no one way to do democracy, but the idea of just having open, transparent, and accountable government for people, that's what I hoped we would see come out of the Arab Spring. Obviously, that's not exactly what happened, although I think still, if I look at what's going on in the region or even in Syria, you still have people and subsequent generation of people, younger people, who are still dissatisfied and are still wanting to see change and are still willing to fight for it. Unfortunately, their circumstances are much more complicated in a strange way than they were in 2011. There's a lot more regional and global actors who are participating in these conflicts, and they're a lot more complex and a lot more gray than they used to be.
Right. Speaking of these external actors, Turkey launched Operation Peace Spring to take control of Kurd-controlled areas in northeast Syria last October. What did you hear from your people on the ground in terms of what the U.S. pullout and subsequent Turkish incursion meant for locals in these areas?
Right. Going back to this issue of demographic engineering, as I mentioned, the Assad regime, has been the primary participant in that issue. However, Turkey also has done demographic engineering in Syria by the way they've inserted themselves into different portions of Syria and the way they've displaced certain communities, such as in Afrin or in Ras Al Ain. We can't pretend that those things didn't happen. They did. And so what my concern and many other people's concerns are is that this displacement of these people and this demographic engineering creates other long-term conflicts that even if the Syrian conflict as it currently exists were to be solved tomorrow, it wouldn't solve these now other localized communal conflicts that have been created as a result of some of the dynamics of the conflict, and that includes Turkey's participation in the invasion of Afrin district and out in eastern Syria in Ras Al Ain district. So our hope always is that that somehow, some way, there can be engagement with Turkey to convince them that anyone who wishes to return home can, that there'll be more accountability for some of the proxy militia forces that they support that have conducted human rights violations, and that they will support that process if for no other reason, because it would help their own long-term security and stability to be able to be a more responsible actor on the ground with civilian populations.
But it sounds like you don't expect that to be happening soon, for people to return to the areas formerly controlled by the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces, or SDF.
I don't think so. Again, the trust gap is so wide between those communities and Turkey that you would have to first do a lot of work on the ground, either again by the Turkish government or their proxy forces, to convince people that it was safe enough and that there was rule of law available, that they could in fact return and feel secure. And until now, I don't see that happening. So I don't think people will risk returning to their areas unless there's substantive changes on the ground. And I'm not sure the dynamics of the conflict as they are would allow that to happen. Especially for Turkey, they're facing this existential crisis over how many more millions of refugees might be entering Turkey itself. So for them, they're like, okay, well, if worse comes to worse, maybe we can at least move people from Idlib around. Well, by moving them around, you're then altering the communities themselves in other parts of Syria in ways that, as I said, can or will create other long-term communal conflicts that have yet to bubble up, but they will eventually. So Turkey doesn't have great options. Some of these issues are of their own making, but unfortunately, quite a number of the issues are a result of circumstances out of their control, and they're just kind of doing damage control without a whole lot of support from their NATO allies.
On Monday, Erdogan proposed to Putin that Turkey rebuild Syria using the oil revenues from Kamishli and Deir ez-Zor. The first problem with this plan is that these two areas are controlled by the SDF, which Turkey, of course, views as a terrorist group linked to the PKK. The SDF is an ally of the U.S., which has been helping protect these oil fields. Erdogan said he plans to discuss the issue with Trump. I wonder, do you see this plan going anywhere?
I don't think so. Congress and the Department of Defense and numerous agencies within the U.S. government have made it clear that if the United States interferes at all with the issue of oil or oil revenue, tries to use said oil revenue or direct it or do anything with it that looks like the United States is appropriating a resource of another sovereign nation state without permission, that this would cause all sorts of problems for the United States in other countries and in other areas of interest from a legal perspective. So I think it's true the United States would like to see the SDF use the oil revenues more responsibly to stabilize SDF-controlled portions of Jazeera region or northeast Syria. And they would like them not to sell that oil to certain actors like the Assad regime or perhaps even Iran. However, I don't think the United States really has much leverage in terms of directing oil revenue or profits unless they're willing to break all sorts of legal standards and norms to do it, which I think there's enough backlash here against that concept or that idea, whether it's from Congress or from internally within the different agencies of the executive branch, that would be hard to do. What they could do, however, is they could try and convince the SDF in Turkey to make a deal. But as we know, for such a deal to occur, that would require a much broader deal, I would say, that has regional implications and has more to do with the overall Turkish-Kurdish relationship writ large. So it would start with the SDF in Turkey, but it would inevitably have to have a discussion about the Kurds in Turkey, the Kurds in Iraq, the Kurds in Syria. I mean, it would become like a very big deal and agreement and framework that would take a lot of time and effort to negotiate. But again, the trust gap is just so large. I mean, it would take an enormous amount of effort on part of the United States to get it going. And as we know right now, I mean, the United States and the West in general has a whole bunch of other problems they're dealing with. The recent one now being, of course, coronavirus and keeping on top of that, and the the slump in oil prices and the fight between Saudi Arabia and Russia over oil. So I wish that there would be enough space and oxygen in the room to allow for a more focused policy vis-a-vis Turkey, Syria, and frankly Turkey and the Kurdish community. However, I just I don't see that there's enough oxygen in the room at the moment to accommodate that kind of a push diplomatically or politically.
That's a good lead into my last question for you. You have worked on aid issues in Syria for years. What do you think the West, the international community, could or perhaps should do to help these 3 million displaced people in Idlib?
Right.
What's possible?
So first, they need to go back to the UN and get the border crossings that are between Turkey and Syria to be reauthorized. There's been this UNSC resolution that authorizes what are the official border crossings. In the last round of voting, I think out of the original 4, only 2 were authorized, and neither of them were Turkey. So this is one. 2, the United States and Europe, if they're really serious about mitigating this refugee crisis, they need to go and they need to talk with Turkey, make some concessions, and make a deal with them about opening more border crossings and allowing aid to more effectively and more quickly get in to meet the needs. Because now you have, before you had people, maybe you had half of the population that needed consistent humanitarian aid, like day to day, but the other half only needed humanitarian aid maybe 50% of the time, and the other 50% of the time they had small jobs, they had work, they had livelihoods, they had farming, they had other things that could sustain themselves. Now, and I haven't seen the numbers recently, but likely you're talking 90% of these people need day-to-day humanitarian aid to survive. That is not a sustainable model. So we need to really think hard about how we're going to help these people survive and come up with a better sustainable model for humanitarian aid for Idlib. I mean, one way is, yes, to a degree, if we want these people to be able to survive, they need enough geographic space so that they have enough capacity to conduct livelihoods programming, so that they can do some subsistence farming, do some small jobs, generate enough income and an economy that they're not totally reliant on the international community. But to do that, there needs to be space. If we're looking right now at what's going on, we're looking at the complete Gazification of Idlib and packing 3.5 million people into a very small area, which does not lend itself to that kind of humanitarian or livelihoods model. And then the other thing is, really, I mean, we've said it now for 9 years, we need a no-fly zone over Idlib. We just do. I mean, the Russian bombing campaign and the regime's bombing campaign just makes it impossible to create enough stability to keep these people from being displaced. And every time people are displaced, any work the international community or the humanitarian aid community is doing in terms of keeping people alive gets disrupted. And with this disruption comes more problems, especially if you look at all the healthcare centers that have been bombed and destroyed over the last 2 months of the campaign. I mean, it'll take months to rebuild all of that and put services in place and convince healthcare workers to go back, or to train other healthcare workers to replace the ones that were killed in the airstrikes. I mean, we're talking about a whole interconnected set of problems that all need to be managed sort of simultaneously. But again, I don't see Europe or the United States willing to do what needs to be done in order to truly stabilize Idlib. And then the other thing, finally, that's important, which everyone always forgets about, is you're talking about, perhaps half of the entire population of Idlib now are people under the age of 18. They haven't had any structured, consistent access to education. They're being influenced by, this ideology that HTS espouses. We need to be working more directly to help create psychological resilience against that ideology. But to do that, we need to give people access to education. And we also need to work on psychosocial support and providing trauma victims better access to mental health care, which is something that we really, really have not seen enough support for over the past 9 years.
Sounds like a great deal of work to be done there in Idlib. Sasha Ghosh-Siminoff, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome.
You can follow Ahval News Online podcast series through Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Google Podcasts, SoundCloud, and Spreaker. All you need to know about Turkey is here, for your ears, mind, and attention. Thank you for listening to our podcast.